Here today with the Reverend Dr. Otis Moss III. Otis is Senior Pastor of Trinity United Church of Christ in Chicago, Illinois. He is an ordained minister in the Progressive National Baptist Convention and the United Church of Christ. He's on the boards of Auburn Seminary and Faith in Place Action Fund and chaplain of the Children's Defense Fund's Samuel DeWitt Proctor Child Advocacy Conference. Additionally, Dr. Moss is a senior fellow in the Auburn Seniors Fellow Program. So, Otis, it's such a pleasure to have you here. It's always an honor to be able to speak with you, and I just love, learning from you and hearing what your perspectives are on so many different topics.
Well, thanks a lot, Brian. It's a delight to be with you, and we really appreciate the work that you're doing.
Well, thank you so much. It's been a blessing for me to be able to do this kind of stuff. So maybe we can first start off what's new in your land. I know that there was a new sermonic film that just recently came out. It was a follow-on to Letter to My Son. Would you like to talk a little bit about that?
Sure, I would love to. We've been doing a series of sermonic films. It's a new term and genre we have been working on, and we're looking to making this an actual genre. So we are applying for this to be a genre within the Screen Actors Guild as sermonic film. But the latest film is entitled Letter to My Son. This is the third in a series. The first one was The Cross and the Lynching Tree, a requiem for Ahmaud Arbery. The second one was Weary Throats and New Songs that spoke about the power of song during moments of resistance and challenge in our lives personally and collectively in the nation. And this final one, well, it's not the final one, but the latest one, I should say, is a letter that, inspired by a letter I wrote to my son Elijah several years ago in the wake of Michael Brown's killing. And it sparked some conversation. What is your responsibility as a young African-American person? What are the fears and the hopes that I have as a parent? How do you negotiate this world that oftentimes people will not value you and will see you a particular way, no matter what is in your heart, no matter what is in your spirit or in your mind, they will assume and place nefarious intentions on you. So we created a film around this that was based off the idea of me speaking directly to my son Elijah, and really speaking for all parents, speaking for all fathers, speaking for all mothers. And we created a variety of scenes demonstrating and showing young people interacting in a variety of ways. I don't want to give all of it away, but it was a wonderful experience. It was very moving. We had a cast of about 20 young people who did a great job acting, and they enjoyed participating, especially in these pandemic times where there's not much to do. They were so excited to be able to participate in the filming, which took from 9 a.m. to about almost 10 p.m., a full day of filming. And every single one of those young people stayed all day. They were delighted to be there because they had nothing else to do. And it was really wonderful to create that camaraderie with them and the filmmakers, all the technical people, the costume, makeup, everybody that has been distant as a result of the pandemic. It was wonderful to see so many people that we hadn't seen in months. So part of it was, yes, the film, but the other part was just the sheer fellowship was a joy.
Well, it's a wonderful film. We've shared it on Compassionate Christianity in our email newsletter and social media. And for anybody that's looking for it, can we just send them to the YouTube channel for the church?
To YouTube, yes, the Trinity United Church of Christ YouTube channel. Just search Letter to My Son. It's there. We're hoping to create a study guide that will go with that, a discussion guide. We want people to use it. Use it in your conversation with your young people, with your children. Use it in a conversation to talk about racism and anti-racism and systematic racism. Use it in the context of what does it mean to have a tender heart and a tough soul in these times. And so I think it can be used in a variety of different places.
So the main topic of our conversation today is faith, hope, and love during an election. So I'd love to get your perspective on kind of where you see the country today overall.
Ooh, how much time do you have?
As long as you'd like.
Um, I think the United States is in a period of trying to decide whether it will move into a Reconstruction mode or whether it will move into an anti-Reconstruction mode. I use that as a historical marker because right after emancipation, you had the Reconstruction period, and we had some of the most amazing gains in our country. As a matter of fact, you had some of the greatest political leadership in the United States, where you had participation from all who were able to lead states in South Carolina, Georgia, Louisiana. And because African Americans were coming out of that period of enslavement, you had leadership that was so cognizant of operating with integrity and a high level of ethics in terms of their engagement with the government. And so it's been written that you had some of the greatest levels of governmental efficiency and also in terms of integrity and transparency, all because they understood the environment. Then you had the backlash, the period of resentment that led us down the road of lynching, of Jim Crow, of mass incarceration, that entrenched structural systematic racism in the United States. And so I really see that we're in this period. Are we going to be in a period where we reach out for a Reconstruction period, where we engage the ghosts of the Confederacy and the antebellum period, or will we move into a period of resentment or a period of forgetting? Many times we have in the United States where we just forget. We have no interest in studying our history, of using history as a marker of understanding where people before us have already been. Will we have historical and spiritual amnesia? This is where we are. We're teetering between these two places right now.
Well, I think that's a great term. I know I've just begun to really do any digging in terms of Reconstruction, and I knew about Jim Crow, knew about segregation and things like that. I didn't realize there was as much accomplished during Reconstruction, and then basically obliterated.
Just obliterated. It's an extraordinary period of history. It really is, of America making a decision similar to a Marshall Plan to say, what do you do with a completely decimated portion of the United States as a result of civil war and the enslavement period? But the North had gained so much wealth, and the United States in general had gained so much wealth because of the antebellum period. There was plenty of money in the coffers in order to do the work of rebuilding the South, because if you didn't rebuild the South, you're talking about actually destroying the economic viability of the nation.
Well, but not only the physical rebuilding, but I mean, just politically, for the progress that was made for African Americans during that period of time,
Extraordinary.
Beginning to have some, as you said, political presence and, equality, sort of. It was just amazing. I felt in terms of how much was accomplished there that went away.
Yeah, it was one of my favorite stories is a gentleman by the name of Robert Smalls, and I would encourage anyone who is listening to read about Robert Smalls. I think he's one of the most extraordinary human beings in not only American history, in a history period. To go from an enslaved African, and I wish somebody would make a movie about him.
I'm surprised that hasn't happened.
I'm shocked too, because the elements of suspense and drama are absolutely incredible. That people may not know that Robert Smalls, along with 11 other people, they stole a Confederate warship and they sailed it to the Union forces, and it was presented as a gift to Abraham Lincoln. He became the first African-American captain in the Union Army. He moves back to South Carolina. He buys the land and the house where he was a slave. He buys the plantation. He lives there. He allows the mistress of the plantation, the widow of the slave owner, to live on the property, not in the house where she used to live, but somewhere in the back. You know, I always joke and say that. But he also then becomes one of the first Black elected officials in South Carolina, and puts in place what we consider to be the public school system on a grammar school, elementary school level, by starting these schools for people of African descent. So the precursor of what we think of the public school system comes from Robert Smalls.
Wow.
He's an extraordinary human being. He never had traditional education, deeply committed to his faith, felt that he was called to do this work. And he had to go back to the land of his pain and the place where he was disinherited to change the soil and the air of South Carolina so that everyone could, quote unquote, breathe free.
I need to read up on him. I've heard this story, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. I knew kind of about the level that you just described, but I think I need to read more about that and, you know, start spreading the word about it so more people.
Yeah, he's
an amazing
wonderful individual. He's one of my favorite in the pantheon of, I think, the greatest Americans ever. It's Robert Smalls.
So kind of getting back to today, we have a huge election coming up, and our country's about as polarized as I've ever seen it. What ways have you found to be most effective in speaking about politics when people don't necessarily share your views?
You know, it's interesting. We're in such a polarized moment, and we don't have an opportunity, especially now in a pandemic, to really be in a face-to-face situation with people. But in the moments that I have, there are several things that are helpful. Food, story, humor, and irony. So those are usually very helpful. One, food, of having conversation around food and being in the midst of showing commonality in reference to how foodways transcend geography. They mesh together. Even though something may be created in one particular place, but it's influenced by another place, foodways are like music. They move into different spaces. The other is telling family stories and stories that are personal. For example, like the Robert Smalls story that I told. I don't care what side you're on. People find Robert Smalls inspiring.
And really,
and everybody believes that someone like Robert Smalls should be able to thrive in America, because we still operate out of this peculiar American exceptionalism that is in itself a myth, but that's another conversation. And so the telling of story and getting people connected to story and letting them lean in reference to story. And then from there, you can then bring in the humor and the irony. That isn't it ironic that a person like Robert Smalls is disinherited? Everybody agrees we shouldn't disinherit Robert Smalls. No one will, unless they are really an entrenched, just flat out curmudgeon racist, and their last name is Bunker and their first name is Archie. They may say that he should, he should be disinherited. But most people agree on that. And that is a story to build on, because most of the walls that we have built politically in America, many of them, they're mythical. They are mythical. So we operate in this social media bubble where we just lean into and drink from recycled water that just continues to flow things that are that we agree with and that are destructive to our own development and to democratic development. But when you bring in story, when you're with someone with food and you're talking food and then go into story, then you use some humor, then the irony of shouldn't we all be able to thrive, then take the next step and talk about barriers to thriving, then take the next, and don't even use the trigger language, because there's some trigger language for people. As soon as they, some people hear certain terms, they can't even have a conversation. So I'm always up to I will get you to commit to the fact of that we should all have the opportunity to breathe free. And then without using the language that triggers, begin to talk about the avenues of how we can breathe free. And before you know it, you got everybody agreeing with you. And then you mention the trigger language and they say, well, I don't agree with you. I said, but you just agreed with me for the last 45 minutes. So the language is what you don't like, but the story you agree with. And that's where we really have to get a lot of people.
So let's use our imagination for a moment, and we're after the election, and there have been a whole slew of people that have been elected who are supportive of a new flavor of Reconstruction and battling systemic racism. Mm-hmm. What would you like to see the politicians do?
Well, let me put it this way. I believe that we have elected officials and not representatives, and there's a difference. Elected officials will usually follow a power structure on those that they have been lobbying. Politicians will. Elected officials, representatives are people who will follow a particular moral compass and an agenda that's been laid out by a community or groups of people. And that's one of the things that we have to be able to hammer out. A true agenda that has a moral compass. So I leave that as a foundation. One area there has to be a voting rights bill that protects everyone's right to vote, that we can no longer have the mythic shenanigans that have happened and are happening currently, whether it is with, we're talking about the U.S. Postal Service, whether it is this myth of massive voter fraud. We need to find a way to have a federal law that everyone's right is protected. And I believe that that's one piece that we have to. The other piece in connection with that, I think there has to be a movement to remove the Electoral College, or to make the Electoral College directly connected to the popular vote. And then all of a sudden we have a different political conversation at that point, because there's no more vote manipulation. So then politicians then have to lean into being representatives and not just elected officials who are following the lobbying of certain well-off groups.
All really admirable things. Certainly another one I would vote for is undoing this ability for unlimited political contributions.
Oh gosh! Oh, absolutely, without a doubt. I mean, we can go on for days on it. I mean, unlimited contributions, and the system is without a doubt. You look at it two ways. You can say it's broken, or it's working the way it's supposed to. Either way, it does not function for those who do not have the access to the halls of power and are not wealthy. You have to have a system in place that leans into the disinherited. And as a person of faith, I believe that our faith leans and speaks to those who have their backs against the wall. And so Jesus raises the question. He says, for those, what you did to those who were hungry, you did also to me. In other words, when you take away aid for dependent children, you did it for me. If you didn't visit me in prison, or in other words, those of you who put in the system of mass incarceration, you did it also to me. It goes on and on, that we have a faith tradition that leans into the disinherited, that says that I judge not only the church, but I judge nations by how you treat the poorest of the poor. And that is a lesson, compassionate Christianity. That is a lesson that this nation is yet to get. We have empire religion instead of having a faith that speaks to those who are disinherited.
It's not like we don't have a good role model.
No, we have a great role model.
Right? A well recorded
Right.
role model. So, yeah. So for just lay people out there, in addition to actually getting out and voting, what additional steps do you suggest that people take in order to positively affect the election?
Well, one is community investment, meaning community change. I believe that communities or faith communities, whatever those groups are, should raise a question about how do we invest and transform communities that are disinherited, communities that are marginalized, communities where individuals are hurting and they do not have a voice on a local level. I'll give you an example here in Chicago. I was just over on the west side of Chicago. There's a wonderful ministry known as New Life Church, primarily a Latino community, serving people who are undocumented. They have an incredible feeding program at New Life. It's extraordinary. And what they're doing is they have fed over the last, I want to get this right, over the last, I think a month, 2 months, they have fed 65,000 people.
Wow.
It's been extraordinary because remember that those who are undocumented are afraid to go to traditional places to receive food, but it doesn't stop there. New Life recognized that they were in the midst, where their church sits is a boundary between three different gang territories. So what did they do? They directly went out to those communities, to those street organizations, and said, look, we're distributing food. And some people cannot cross the boundary to come here to get the food. We want to partner with you. You distribute in your area. We will. And so they built a relationship literally where they fill up vans of food and the food is distributed by gang members. Now that is an entryway for them to do ministry with the gang members. If somebody's listening and say, oh my gosh, you're distributing food, gang members. No, that's just a step so that they can now build a relationship. So what happened as a result of these long-term relationships, when there is a beef that happens in the community, those who are street organizers, who are leaders in these gangs will come to New Life and say, something is about to jump off. Can you intervene?
Wow.
You don't want someone to get hurt.
Wow.
That happens when you build relationships. Now that is local organizing with a moral compass, spiritual foundation that speaks to the least of these. It started simply with just giving some food, and now it's organizing around stopping violence. It's a powerful ministry, and it's a model that anybody can use nationwide.
Wow. Talk about innovation. That's really great.
Yeah, they do great work. They really do. They do wonderful
Well, we need
work.
to help get the story out about that, don't we?
Yeah, absolutely. Matt DeMatteo, he's the executive director for their program. And New Life is primarily an Anglican church, but they planted a Latino church. And that church said, hey, we want to not be a reformed congregation. We want to be a congregation that meets the needs of those right here. So they completely reformed how they do ministry to meet the needs instead of one size fits all. We're going to be this reformed congregation in this community. They said, no, we're a Latino community serving that's Latino-centric, that speaks Spanish, that will serve undocumented workers here in this community. And they're doing it, and they are doing a tremendous job.
That's really fascinating. They're so great to hear. So what about for lay leaders across the country leading up the election? You know, what do you suggest that they do, and what should they say to their congregations?
I think that any person who is in a position to be able to speak to a congregation is you have to speak truth to power. I think that for primarily, and I use the term so-called or who call themselves white congregations, because I think that that's a social construction, that there has to be a conversation about how do we attack systematic racism in this moment, how to be anti-racist, how do we become ethnic again over being white. And those are two very different things. There's a difference between operating out of an ethnicity, which has a history and a heritage, versus operating out of a social construction. And I always joke and use the term that if you leave the United States, no one welcomes you in Europe to say, welcome, you're white. They raise a question about your national origin, and then they look at your last name and raise a question about your ethnicity. Oh, you're Scottish.
Absolutely.
Oh, so it becomes
yeah.
a question of history and heritage. And with questions of history and heritage, you can build relationships, because with ethnicity, you start talking food, you start talking stories, you start talking bad jokes. You go through all those things when you start talking ethnicity. But when we talk race social construction, we don't have those things. You all of a sudden get to be part of a privileged group. So there has to be a conversation, I believe, in this day and age around how do we regain our ethnicity again? Because by regaining our ethnicity, we regain our story, we regain our spirit, we regain our compassion, and we begin walking down the road of dismantling structures that are destructive to the human personality.
So, Otis, just to close here, if you had to think about one important outcome of the election, mm-hmm. what would you like to see?
That COVID-45 is defeated. Deal with COVID-19 and dismantle COVID-16-19.
There you go. Oh, wow, that's really good. A little creative stringing there. Yeah, well, let's hope so. Let's pray so.
That is my prayer. I am praying that we will be able to stand in line if it's 12 hours to vote, because I know there's a lot of voter suppression going on. And I am praying and working with those who are in battleground states, those in South Carolina and Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas, where polling places have been taken away, where people during a primary had to stand in line in a pandemic for 10 hours.
It's ridiculous. It's just unbelievable.
There's no reason that a 90-year-old woman should be sitting in a chair for 8 hours to vote. To me, it's unconscionable, it's unethical, and it borders in the realm of being drawn into what is evil.
It is. I mean, there's no question about it, mm-hmm. in my mind. So anyway. Well, Otis, again, I really want to thank you for spending some time with us. It's always such a pleasure to hear from you.
I always enjoy talking with you all.
Yeah. Well, so thanks so much for doing that.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for having me.